"I heard you were leaving," he said, and his voice went quiet in a way she felt deep in the hollow of her chest, somewhere below words and reason, somewhere she had spent the better part of 3 months trying to wall off with brick and mortar and sheer stubborn will. Ella Garner froze with her hand on the buckle of her saddlebag, the leather worn smooth under her fingers, the morning air cold and sharp against the back of her neck. The sun had barely cracked the ridge above Dusty Creek when she had slipped from the boarding house, moving fast and quiet, the way a person moves when they are running from something they cannot name out loud. She had not expected Roy Crawford to be standing in the livery doorway at this hour, hat in hand, jaw set in that particular way of his that sat somewhere between anger and something far more dangerous than anger. She did not turn around. "Word travels fast in a small town," she said, and she was proud of how steady her voice came out, proud of how none of the betrayal she felt showed in those 6 flat words. Ella, just her name, that was all. And yet the way he said it undid something in her that she had worked very hard to keep tied down. She turned slowly, because turning away from Roy Crawford when he said her name like that was a thing that apparently lay beyond the reach of her considerable willpower. He looked like he had not slept. The dark crescents under his eyes and the particular exhaustion around his mouth told her that much. His shirt was untucked on one side, his dark hair uncombed, and he was holding his hat with both hands the way a man holds something when he needs to keep his hands from doing something else. He stood 6 feet tall in the livery doorway with the pale gray light of dawn behind him and the smell of hay and horses and cold wood smoke all around them, and Ella thought, not for the first time, that Roy Crawford was the most devastatingly unfair thing that had ever happened to her. "You were going to leave without saying a word," he said. "I was going to leave," she agreed, turning back to her saddlebag. "The rest of it is my own business." The sound of his boots on the packed earth floor was slow and deliberate. She heard every step. She kept her eyes on the buckle. "After everything," he said quietly, "after all of it, you were just going to ride out." And there it was. The accusation wrapped in hurt, wrapped in something so raw she nearly flinched. She pulled the buckle tight and let the silence sit between them, because if she opened her mouth right now, she was going to say things she had been carefully not saying for 3 months, and saying them would mean staying, and staying was the one thing she absolutely could not afford to do. Not in Dusty Creek. Not in 1884. Not with a secret that could get her killed. She had arrived in Dusty Creek in late August of that year, riding in on a bay mare named Copper with $12 to her name and a lie on her lips. She told people she was a widow from Abilene, which was half true. She told people she was looking for work as a seamstress, which was entirely true. She did not tell people that the man she had fled was not dead, as a widow's husband ought to be, but very much alive and very much the kind of man who sent others to do the kind of work that ended quietly in the dark. His name was Harlan Voss. He was not a husband, though he had told her she would be his wife. He was a land speculator and a fraud and a man of terrifying patience. And Ella had been his bookkeeper for 2 years before she understood what the numbers in his ledgers actually meant. She had understood it on a Tuesday in June, when a rancher named Prescott came to the office bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, saying that Harlan Voss had sent men to burn his barn and drive off his cattle because he would not sell his land below what it was worth. She had looked at the ledger open on her desk, and she had understood, with the cold clarity of a person who is very good with numbers, that Prescott was not the first, that there had been others. That the columns of figures she had been so carefully maintaining were a map of ruin drawn in ink. She had taken the ledger. It was a small book, bound in dark green cloth, and it contained enough evidence to bring Harlan Voss before a federal judge if it ever reached the right hands. The wrong hands, and it would bring Ella Garner to a very permanent end. She had been riding southwest ever since, moving from town to town, keeping her head down and her ears open, trying to find a federal marshal she could trust in a territory where Voss's money reached further than she could see. Dusty Creek had not been part of the plan. Dusty Creek had been a blown horseshoe and a lame mare, and the necessity of stopping for 4 days while Copper recovered. 4 days had turned into a week, and then 2, and then the widow from Abilene had quietly become a fixture at Mrs. Holt's boarding house, and the owner of a small but growing seamstress business out of the back of Hawkins' General Store. That was how things were in September, before Roy Crawford. He had come into the general store on a Thursday morning in late September to pick up a bolt of canvas, and Ella had been on her knees behind the counter, refolding a bolt of calico that had gotten loose, and she had stood up abruptly and they had nearly collided, and he had grabbed her by the arm to keep her from toppling over the fabric bolts, and for one suspended second they had stood very close together, her hand braced against his chest, his hand warm and steady on her arm. Both of them breathing. "Roy Crawford," he had said, stepping back and touching his hat. Not extending a hand for shaking, just that small formal acknowledgement, as if he understood she might not want a stranger's hand right away. That small courtesy had noticed itself somewhere in the back of Ella's mind. "Ella Garner," she had said. He was the sheriff's deputy of Dusty Creek. She learned over the following days from Mrs. Holt, who had opinions on everyone in town. He was 28 years old and had come to the territory from Missouri 6 years prior, and had been deputized 3 years ago by Sheriff Ed Marsh, who was 64 and more interested in his rocking chair than in riding circuit anymore. Roy Crawford effectively ran law and order for Dusty Creek and the surrounding 40 miles of rangeland, which meant he was perpetually busy and perpetually underpaid, which two facts he seemed to accept with a philosophical equanimity that Mrs. Holt found admirable and Ella found quietly fascinating. "He is a good man," Mrs. Holt had said firmly over supper one evening, in the tone of someone settling a debate that had not actually been started. "There are not so many of those that you can afford to overlook one when you see him." Ella had smiled and passed the biscuits and said nothing. She had been determined in those first weeks to keep herself at a careful distance from Roy Crawford. He was law, and she was a woman carrying a stolen ledger that implicated a powerful man, and the combination of those two facts made proximity to any deputy, however well-intentioned, a very specific variety of danger. She had been cordial when their paths crossed, which in a town of 400 souls was not infrequently. She had been pleasant and unrevealing. She had been, she believed, quite good at the performance of a simple widow from Abilene with no complications and no secrets worth knowing. Roy Crawford had not been deceived, not entirely. She saw it in the way he watched her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, that particular quality of attention that a careful person gives to a puzzle they have not yet solved but intend to. He was not suspicious in a hostile way. It was more like concern, which was somehow worse. October came in golden and cold, and the work of their daily lives created inevitable intersections. He fixed the loose hinge on the back door of Hawkins' store without being asked, and without making a production of it. She made him a canvas work vest from the bolt he had come in for, cutting and stitching it herself after hours, because she had seen it was what he needed and she was very good at seeing what people needed, and because doing something for him with her hands felt safer than doing something for him with words. He had stood in the store doorway holding the vest and looking at it for a long moment. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," she said. "Consider it payment for the hinge." He had put it on right there in the doorway, shrugging into it and settling it across his shoulders, and Ella had turned back to her work before he could see her face, because her face had done something she did not want it to do when he wore the thing she had made for him. The trouble with Roy Crawford was not that he was handsome, though he was, with his dark eyes and the particular directness of his gaze, and the way he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who was secure in himself, without needing to demonstrate it. The trouble was that he was kind in a way that was not performed. The trouble was that he listened when people talked, actually listened, and he remembered what they said, and he treated people with a straightforward respect that did not vary based on what they owned or who their people were. The trouble was that he was exactly the kind of man that a woman with a dark past and a dangerous secret and a green ledger hidden under a floorboard in her room at Mrs. Holt's boarding house had absolutely no business falling in love with. And yet, November arrived with frost on the windows and the first real cold of the coming winter, and by that time, Ella Garner was in a considerable amount of trouble that had nothing to do with Harlan Voss. They had fallen into an easy habit of shared suppers at the boarding house when his circuit allowed for it, Mrs. Holt presiding over the table with the satisfaction of a woman whose matchmaking instincts had been fully vindicated even though nobody had asked her to have instincts about anything. They talked in the evenings sometimes, after supper, sitting on opposite ends of Mrs. Holt's narrow porch, with cups of coffee going cold in their hands, talking about nothing important and everything real. He told her about Missouri, and about why he had left, and about what the territory had been when he first arrived, and what he hoped it might become. She told him about her childhood in Kansas, about her mother, who had been a school teacher, and about the love of books that her mother had given her and that she carried still. She told him true things that were not the whole truth, and she told them with such care that she thought he believed her, though sometimes she saw that careful quality of attention on his face and was less certain. "You are very private," he said one evening. "That is your right. I'm not asking you to be otherwise." "But," she said. "But nothing," he said quietly. "I just want you to know that whatever it is you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. If you ever decide you want someone to know." She had looked at the dark sky above the porch and the winter stars scattered across it, and she had felt with a force that frightened her the desire to tell him everything. The ledger under the floorboard, Harlan Voss, the burned barns and the driven cattle and the ranchers ruined by a patient, methodical man with a gift for making violence look like misfortune. All of it. She had not told him. She could not put him in that position. He was a deputy in a small territorial town, and Harlan Voss had powerful friends in high offices, and the kind of danger that followed her was not something she was willing to bring down on a man who had done nothing but be kind to her. But she had said, more quietly than she intended, "I know." And he had looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, and something had passed between them that was not quite a declaration but was more than nothing. And Ella had taken her cold coffee cup inside and lain awake in the dark until 2 in the morning, which was her own fault entirely. December came, and with December came the news that changed everything. It arrived in the form of a man named Cutter, who rode into Dusty Creek on a gray Tuesday evening and took a room at the town's only hotel, the Territorial. He was thin and long-faced with pale eyes, and he wore a city man's coat badly, and he asked questions at the saloon about recent arrivals in town and about women who might have come through heading southwest. Mrs. Holt's nephew, a boy of 15 named Clem who ran errands and had ears like a fox, heard the questions and ran directly to his aunt, who met Ella in the parlor before breakfast the next morning with a look on her face that was not alarm but contained alarm within it, the way a dam contains water. "There is a man asking about you," Mrs. Holt said, "or about someone like you. He described a woman fitting your looks arriving in late summer." Ella heard every word. She set down her coffee cup with enormous care. "What else did he say?" "Nothing specific. He was asking at the saloon. Clem has good ears." "Yes," Ella said, "he does." She was dressed and out of the boarding house before the other boarders came down for breakfast, moving through the cold morning toward the general store, and the whole walk she was doing the calculation she had been dreading. Cutter was a finder. Voss used finders. He had sent someone once before, in a small town in Kansas 2 months into her flight, and she had been out the back window and riding hard before the man got within 2 streets of her. She had gotten lucky that time. She did not know if she would be lucky again. She went to the general store and she opened it and she stood behind the counter and she thought. The ledger was under the floorboard. She needed to retrieve it without being seen. She needed a horse that was fully rested and sound, which Copper currently was. She needed food for 3 days and ammunition for the small Remington Derringer she carried in her coat pocket, and she needed to be out of Dusty Creek by nightfall. What she needed, most pressingly and most inconveniently, was not to think about Roy Crawford. She had spent that day in a state of focused, controlled terror, doing everything necessary for a departure she had always known was coming, and still somehow felt entirely unprepared for. Late afternoon, she retrieved the ledger from beneath the floorboard in her room, tucking it inside her corset where it sat flat against her ribs, the hard edges of the cover like a second heartbeat. She packed only what she could carry easily. She wrote a brief note to Mrs. Holt, thanking her for her kindness and leaving the last 2 weeks of rent money on the nightstand. She almost wrote a second note and stopped herself. She woke before dawn and went to the livery. And that was where Roy Crawford was standing in the doorway with his hat in both hands and his eyes telling her things she was not ready to receive. "After everything," he said again, and she heard it differently this time, heard the specific shape of the hurt in it, and she turned away from the saddlebag and faced him fully in the cold half-dark of the livery with hay dust drifting between them. "Roy," she said, "there is a man in town who is here because of me. And the man who sent him is the kind of person who makes people disappear. And if I stay here, I put you in danger and Mrs. Holt in danger and every person in this town who has been kind to me. So I am leaving." That is the whole truth of it. He was quiet for so long she could hear copper shifting in her stall and the distant crow of a rooster from somewhere behind the feed yard. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. "Roy, Ella." His voice was quiet and unhurried, and it carried the weight of a man who has already made up his mind about something. "I am the deputy of this town. Whatever is following you, I need to know about it so I can address it properly. That is the formal reason. The other reason is that I am asking you as a person who," he started again, "as a person who has a considerable interest in what happens to you. Tell me the rest of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the dark past she had been carrying and the danger she had kept at careful arm's length from everyone in this town, and she thought about what it would mean to put it down, even partially, for the length of time it would take to tell him. "His name is Harlan Voss," she said, "and I took his ledger." She told him all of it, standing in the cold livery in the gray light of early morning, watching his face as she spoke. She told him about the bookkeeping and the ledger, and what the columns of figures meant, and about Prescott with the wound in his shoulder, and the burned barns and the driven cattle. She told him about the flight, the 2 months of moving southwest, the man Voss had sent to Kansas. She took the ledger from inside her corset and handed it to him, and he turned it in his hands and looked at the neat rows of her handwriting, the dates and figures and names, and she watched his jaw tight. "You have been carrying this alone since June," he said. "Yes." "You have been afraid since before you came here." "Yes." He looked up at her. "And you were going to leave without telling me any of it." "I was trying to protect you," she said. "I was trying to protect everyone here." "I know that," he said. "I know that is exactly what you were doing." Something moved through his expression that was not quite anger and was not quite tenderness, but contained both. "Ella, I need you to understand something. I am not a man who needs protecting from the truth of the people he cares about. That is not how I want to receive your care." The word cares landed in the cold morning air between them and stayed there. She found she had nothing useful to say. "The man in town," he said, returning to the immediate problem with the decisive practicality of a person who knows when to set aside emotion in favor of necessity. "His name is Cutter. That is what people call him. I do not know his given name." "I do," Roy said, and there was a hard thing in his voice she had not heard before. "His name is Franklin Cutter, and he was run out of Laramie 2 years ago for assault. He is not a lawman. He has no authority here. He does not need authority. He needs to find me and report back, and then Voss sends something worse. Then we need to move faster than Voss can." Roy handed her back the ledger. "I know a federal marshal. His name is Thomas Birch, and he works out of Santa Fe, and I have known him since Missouri. He is honest, which is not something you can say about every man with a marshal's badge. If this ledger reaches him, Voss is finished. Birch is 3 days' ride from here, Ella said. She had done the mathematics of the territory in her head many times. 2.5 if you ride hard. You can't leave your town to escort me to Santa Fe. Clem can get a message to Sheriff Marsh, Roy said. Marsh is not entirely useless when the situation demands something of him. He looked at her steadily. And there is nowhere else I need to be right now. Ella looked down at the ledger in her hands, at the small green book that had cost her 5 months of her life, and everything she had built before that. And she thought about the forbidden desire she had been fighting since October, the desire to let someone in. And she thought about how Roy Crawford had not flinched when she told him about the dark past, and the stolen evidence and the powerful man who wanted her found. Had just stood in the hay dust and the cold gray light listening with his full and steady attention. "All right," she said. They were out of Dusty Creek before the town was properly awake, riding south and west with Copper, and Roy's big black gelding named Pax moving at a strong canter on the frozen ground. Roy had spent 40 minutes before their departure, leaving a written note for Clem to carry to Sheriff Marsh, speaking to Mrs. Holt in her kitchen while Ella waited outside, checking both horses and both saddles with the thoroughness of a man who understood that equipment failure in open country was a much more serious problem than equipment failure in town. He had also, she noticed, retrieved a rifle from the jail office and added it to his saddle scabbard without making a remark about it. The man Cutter was not at the hotel when Roy checked. He had apparently gone out before dawn, which meant either that he had completed his surveillance and was already riding to report, or that he was watching, which was the more immediately alarming option. They rode south along the creek bed for half a mile before cutting west across open rangeland, away from the road, moving fast across the winter-pale grass with the sun coming up cold and white behind them. Ella had ridden hard before, in fear and in urgency, but riding beside Roy Crawford was a different experience from all the solitary riding she had done these past months. He rode well, which she had expected, with the settled ease of a man and horse who had been together a long time. What she had not expected was the quality of companionship in it, the way he rode at her pace without making a point of it, the way he read the terrain ahead with quiet intelligence and communicated changes of direction with a gesture or a word, no more than necessary. She had been alone with her fear for so long that the simple fact of another person's steady presence beside her in the open country felt, absurdly, like being set down gently after a very long time of being carried at a run. They stopped at midday to water the horses at a stock pond, the water surface skimmed with thin ice at the edges, and ate the provisions Roy had packed standing by the horses because the ground was frozen, and there was no reason to make the horses stand still longer than necessary. It was jerked beef and hard biscuits and cold water from the canteen, and it was one of the better meals Ella had eaten in months. "You said you know Birch from Missouri," she said. "We grew up in the same county," Roy said. "He is 5 years older. He came west before I did. He's a good man, Ella. He will take this seriously. And if Voss has already reached him, men with Voss's money and connections." "Birch is not reachable that way," Roy said with the certainty of a man who has thought about this. "I have known him 33 years, and there is one thing I would stake my life on about Thomas Birch, which is that he cannot be bought. It is not that he is incorruptible in the saint's meaning. He is just—" Roy paused, looking for the word. "He is constitutionally unsuited to dishonesty. He finds it physically uncomfortable. It is actually almost funny in the wrong circumstances." Despite everything, Ella felt something lighten in her chest at the particularity of that description, the humor in it, the intimacy of knowing a man well enough to describe his moral constitution with an almost laugh. "You miss him," she said. "I suppose I do," Roy said, as if this was something he had not examined recently. "We write. It is not the same thing." They rode on through the afternoon, moving through rangeland that opened into broad, shallow valley, before climbing slowly toward the first of the mesas that stood between them and Santa Fe territory. The sky was enormous and pale blue, and the land was beautiful in the way that land is beautiful when it has not yet been subdivided and fenced and stripped of its particular character. Ella had grown up in Kansas, where the land was flat, and the sky was the whole event, and the Southwest was still new enough to her to feel like a revelation each time she looked at it without being afraid. When the light began to go, they found shelter in a dry wash with a south-facing rock wall that held the last heat of the day, and Roy built a small fire with efficient economy, and they sat on opposite sides of it with their blanket rolls behind them. The horses picketed nearby, the fire putting out more warmth than she had expected. Ella sat with the ledger in her lap and looked at the figures she had written by lamplight in Voss's office, the careful columns that added up to something monstrous, and she felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been afraid for so long that the fear has become a kind of furniture, ordinary and unnoticed until someone moves it. "Long were you with him?" Roy asked. "He did not say Voss's name. He did not need to. 2 years as his bookkeeper. Before that I knew him in Abilene as a businessman. Everyone knew him. He was the respectable kind of dangerous, which is the most dangerous kind." "Did he hurt you?" She looked across the fire at him. His face was serious and still, lit on one side by the fire and shadowed on the other. "Not in the way you mean," she said carefully. "He was never violent toward me personally. He reserved that for the people whose land he wanted. With me he was," she searched for the right word, "possessive. He had a way of deciding things about a person's life without asking. He decided I would be his wife. I did not agree, but he did not consider that a relevant input. When I found out what the ledger meant and I understood what he was, leaving it was not a choice I made. It was something that happened to me. I was at his office door with the ledger before I had consciously decided to take it." "That was brave," Roy said. "It was terrifying." "The two are not incompatible," he said quietly. She looked at him across the fire and felt the thing she had been refusing to feel for 3 months arrive in her chest with the permanence of something settling in for a long stay. "Roy," she said, because she felt she ought to say something. "You don't have to say anything," he said, and the gentleness of it was worse than anything demanding would have been. She lay on her side facing the fire with her blanket pulled up, and she listened to the night sounds of the open country, the horses moving quietly at the end of their pickets, the fire settling, Roy breathing on the other side of the fire, steady and even, and she thought about secrets and what it cost to keep them and what it cost to give them up, and she thought about the way he had said the two are not incompatible with such casual certainty. As if he had been waiting for the moment when he could offer her that particular piece of clarity, and she closed her eyes, and for the first time in 5 months, she slept without waking every hour. She woke before dawn to find the fire rebuilt and coffee on, Roy crouching by the flames with his hands wrapped around his cup, looking at the pale streak of light appearing in the east, and she lay still for a moment watching him without being watched in return, storing the image of him in a way she knew she was doing and could not stop. He heard her moving and turned, and the expression on his face in that unguarded early morning second was something she filed away beside the image, something she did not have words for but felt the exact shape and weight of. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. They rode the second day through country that grew steadily more dramatic, the mesas rising around them in shades of ochre and rust and deep gold, the winter light hitting them at angles that made them look constructed, deliberate, like something an architect would have made if an architect had an infinite budget and patience. Ella felt the cold less keenly today, which she attributed to having slept, or possibly to something else she was less willing to examine directly. Roy rode beside her and they talked. Not about Voss or Cutter or Birch or ledgers. They talked about books, because he had mentioned once that he had a small collection, and she had mentioned once that her mother had been a school teacher, and it turned out that they had both read the same edition of David Copperfield in an obvious and somewhat surprising evidence of the long reach of Charles Dickens into the Southwest Territory. They disagreed about which chapter was finest, which led to a serious and genuinely pleasurable discussion that lasted through 2 hours of writing, and at some point during that discussion, Ella became aware that she was laughing at something Roy had said with the full, unchecked, spontaneous laugh that she had not produced in at least 6 months, and she stopped and looked at him with something very close to wonder. "What?" he said, smiling in that way he had, slightly surprised by his own smile. "Nothing," she said. "I had forgotten what it felt like to talk about something that was not survival." Something crossed his face at that, something warm and aching together. "We will talk about books for the rest of the ride," he said. "We have 3 Dickens left, and I want to tell you what I think about Bleak House." "It is very long," she said. "It is worth every page," he said firmly, and they rode on. They reached the outskirts of Santa Fe on the afternoon of the 3rd day, having ridden past the reasonable stopping point of the 2nd evening because they were both alert, and the horses were holding up, and the open country felt too exposed to stop in comfortably. The city was larger than Ella had seen in months, the old adobe architecture of the Plaza District rising around them as they came down the main road, the smell of cooking fires and livestock, and the particular density of a settlement. Ella sat straighter in the saddle and kept her eyes moving in the old habit of assessment, the habit she had developed over 5 months of knowing that any corner could hold something she would need to react to. Roy took them directly to the federal marshal's office, a low building off the plaza with a government seal on the door and 2 horses tied out front that suggested the occupants were in. He helped her down from Copper with his hand steady at her waist for the 2 seconds it took her to find her footing after 3 days in the saddle, and she was grateful for the steadiness and aware of the warmth of his hand, and she said nothing about either. Thomas Birch was precisely what Roy had said he was, which was a man constitutionally unsuited to dishonesty. He was 53, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, with the direct and uncomplicated gaze of a person who has long since stopped troubling himself about how he appears to others. He stood up from behind his desk when they came in, and he looked at Roy with the expression of a man who is genuinely pleased in a way that adult men in the West do not always allow themselves to show, and he put his hand out and Roy took it, and they gripped hard for a moment without speaking, which communicated everything. Then Birch looked at Ella. Then he looked at the ledger she placed on his desk. Then he sat down and read for 45 minutes without a word, while Roy and Ella sat in the 2 chairs against the wall and drank the coffee that Birch's deputy, a young man named Fitch, provided without being asked. When Birch finished reading, he set the ledger down and looked at Ella with an expression of concentrated and specific gravity. "Miss Garner," he said, "this is one of the most complete records of systematic fraud and criminal intimidation I have seen in 20 years in this office. You understand what you have brought me." "I understand exactly what I have brought you," Ella said. "I wrote every word of it." Birch looked at Roy. "She wrote every word of it," he repeated, with the particular appreciation of a man who recognizes precision. "Yes," Roy said. "Voss has friends in the territorial government," Ella said. "Judge Alden in Abilene is in his pocket. I have figures in the ledger that show payments to Alden across 18 months. Birch picked up the ledger again and turned to the relevant pages. He looked at them for a long moment. "Judge Alden falls under federal jurisdiction on any corruption charge," he said. "He cannot block a federal warrant." He stood up. He was a man who made decisions and moved on them with the efficiency of long experience. "I am going to ride to Abilene with 3 deputies and a warrant issued by Judge Carver in Denver, who I will telegraph this afternoon. Voss will be in federal custody before Christmas if the weather holds." "Cutter," Roy said. "One of Voss's men, a finder. He was in Dusty Creek 3 days ago. He may be riding back to report." "I will put a man on the road," Birch said. He extended his hand to Ella. "You will need to give a formal sworn statement, Miss Garner, and you should not return to the territory until Voss is in custody. Can you stay in Santa Fe?" "I can," she said. She shook his hand. His grip was like a closing door. They stayed in Santa Fe. Roy sent word back to Dusty Creek through Birch's office. Marsh was informed, which meant Clem was informed, which meant Mrs. Holt was informed, which was in practical terms the most efficient notification system available. Roy arranged lodgings at a respectable hotel near the plaza, separate rooms side by side, and Ella gave her sworn statement to Birch's Deputy Fitch that same evening, sitting at the marshal's desk with an oil lamp burning, and writing out in her clear, precise hand everything she knew, and when she had known it and what it meant. It took 3 hours and 6 pages of foolscap, and when she finished she felt, for the first time since the Tuesday in June when Prescott had come bleeding into the office, that she had set down something she had been carrying for so long it had begun to feel structural. She sat for a moment in the empty office after Fitch took the statement away, and she put her hands flat on the desk and breathed. Roy was waiting in the hallway outside with his back against the wall and his arms crossed loosely, not pacing, not anxious, just present in the particular way he had of being present, which was the whole of him and none of it performed. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They walked back through the plaza in the cold night air, the city moving around them with its evening sounds, the light of candles and lanterns in the windows of the low adobe buildings, the smell of food and fires, and the particular cold of a high desert winter. They walked without speaking and without the need to speak, and when they reached the hotel and stood in the corridor between their rooms, Ella turned to face him. "Roy," she said, "I owe you an apology. You owe me nothing." "I was going to leave without a word," she said. "That was not the right thing to do, not to you, not after," she stopped. "Not after what we have been to each other these past months, whatever that was." He looked at her in the lamplight of the corridor, and the quiet in his face was not the absence of feeling but the specific concentration of it, everything drawn in and held. "I know what it was," he said. "Do you?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "I know what it was." His hand came up and touched her face, just his fingertips against her cheek, the lightest possible contact, and she felt it everywhere, felt the whole 3 months of careful restraint release at once in a wave of something enormous and simple. "Ella," he said, and it was her name in his voice with nothing held back, which was different from every previous time he had said it. She stepped forward and kissed him, which was something she had been not doing for 3 months with tremendous sustained effort, and he kissed her back with the thoroughness of a man who has also been not doing something for 3 months, and intends to make a full accounting of the deficit. He held her face in both hands and she gripped the lapels of his coat, and the cold hallway of the Santa Fe Hotel became briefly irrelevant. When they stepped back from each other she was breathing somewhat faster than usual, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. "I was going to say that," he said. "I did not want to wait any longer," she said. He smiled fully, the smile that still occasionally caught her off guard in its completeness, and she thought that she was going to spend a very long time learning all the variations of that smile. "No," he said, "neither did I." The days in Santa Fe took on a quality that Ella did not have a word for in her existing vocabulary, though she understood later that what it was simply happiness, the uncomplicated variety that arrives when fear is lifted, and the right person is beside you, and the future is not yet decided, but does not feel threatening. They spent those days together in the city, walking the old streets of the Plaza District, looking at the vendors' stalls in the square where Pueblo traders sold silver work and pottery, eating in the small restaurants off the main road where the food was unlike anything she had tasted in Kansas, and she ate with an enthusiasm that made Roy laugh quietly. He showed her the territorial library, a single room crammed with books and periodicals in no very reliable order, and she stood in the middle of it and felt the old book smell that reminded her of her mother, and of everything her mother had wanted for her. And Roy stood back and watched her with his hands in his pockets and did not say anything, which was exactly right. He told her more about himself in those days than he had in Dusty Creek, perhaps because the confined intensity of the road and the days in the city had stripped away the social formality that governs the way people reveal themselves in the ordinary rhythms of a small town. He told her about his father, who had been a difficult man in the Missouri way of difficult men, and about the specific manner in which the West had felt like a country where a man could decide for himself who he intended to be. He told her about the first years as a deputy, the things he had seen that had been hard, the things he had learned from them. He told these things without self-pity and without drama, in the same quiet matter-of-fact voice he used for everything. And Ella listened with the attention of a person who understands that what they are being given is valuable and rare. She told him in return about the years before Voss, the years of her 20s in Abilene that had been her own, the work she had done, and the friendships she had made, and the particular pleasure she had found in numbers, in the clean logic of a well-kept set of accounts. She told him what it had felt like to discover that logic being used for monstrous ends. She told him about her mother's death 4 years ago, which was the loss she had been carrying longer than any other, and which she had not told anyone about since leaving Kansas. He listened to all of it. He did not offer false comfort or easy resolution. He simply received what she gave him and held it with care, and that was exactly what she needed and had not known how to ask for. On the 5th day in Santa Fe, a telegraph message arrived at Birch's office. Harlan Voss had been taken into federal custody in Abilene. Judge Alden had been removed from the bench pending a federal corruption investigation. Franklin Cutter, apprehended on the road between Dusty Creek and the Kansas border, was in territorial custody and cooperating with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. The ledger that Ella Garner had carried for 5 months through 2 territories was now the central piece of evidence in a federal case that Birch expected to result in convictions across the board. Ella sat in Birch's office with the telegraph message in her hands and read it twice. Then she set it down on the desk and sat very still, because the feeling that moved through her was so large and so complete and so unfamiliar that she needed a moment simply to allow it to exist. Roy was beside her. He put his hand over hers on the desk, warm and steady. "It is over," she said. Her voice was quieter than she expected. "It is over," he agreed. She looked at him. "I can go back to Dusty Creek," she said. "Yes," he said, "or anywhere else you choose." The gentleness in the addendum, the acknowledgement that she was free now to choose without threat or urgency, was one of the most loving things anyone had ever said to her. She understood that he was not asking her to stay, was not using the moment of her relief to bind her to anything. He was simply and entirely supporting her freedom to decide, which meant that when she decided, the decision was hers. Fully and without coercion. Hers in the way that very few things in the preceding 5 years had been hers. "I would like to go back to Dusty Creek," she said, "if there is a reason to." He looked at her. That full, clear, direct gaze. "There is every reason," he said. They rode back to Dusty Creek in 4 days rather than 3 because there was no urgency now and the country was beautiful, and there was no reason to hurry through something that was good. They rode through the Ochre Mesas and the winter rangeland and the creek flats, talking and sometimes not talking, stopping at midday to eat and rest the horses, making camp in the evenings with the efficient companionship of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms in a compressed and intense period, and find those rhythms compatible. On the second evening out of Santa Fe, they sat beside the fire after supper, closer than they had sat on the way out, and Roy said, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been thinking about something and has decided it is time to say it, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that the answer will not change anything between us that is already good." Ella looked at him across the fire. "Go ahead," she said. "Would you consider staying in Dusty Creek permanently?" She waited. "And would you consider staying as my wife," he said, "if the idea is not entirely objectionable?" The last part was delivered with a slight self-consciousness that was so unlike his usual equanimity that she felt a rush of affection for it so sharp it almost hurt. "If the idea is not entirely objectionable," she repeated. He looked at the fire. "It occurs to me that is not the most impressive formulation of a proposal." "It is very honest," she said. "You deserve something better than honest." "I have had beautiful and dishonest," she said. "I prefer honest." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, Roy, the idea is not at all objectionable. The idea is, in fact, what I want. You are what I want." He looked at her, and the firelight caught his face, and she saw everything that was in him in that moment. The relief, and the happiness, and the seriousness beneath both. The quality of a man who does not take what is given to him lightly. He moved around the fire and sat beside her, and kissed her with great tenderness, and she leaned into him. And he put his arm around her, and they sat that way for a long time looking at the fire and the winter stars above the open country. And Ella thought about how the worst thing that had ever happened to her, Harlan Voss and the green ledger and the 5 months of frightened flight, had led her here, to this exact stretch of ground, to this exact warmth, to this exact man. And found she was not at all sorry for the path, only for the fear. They arrived in Dusty Creek on a cold January afternoon in 1885 to find Mrs. Holt standing on her porch with the expression of a woman whose instincts have been fully vindicated and who intends to make no secret of this. She looked at the two of them riding in together, looked at whatever it was that had changed visibly between them, and she folded her hands over her apron and said, "Well," in a tone of supreme satisfaction. "She is impossible," Roy said quietly, without heat. "She is wonderful," Ella corrected. Dusty Creek received Ella Garner's return with the pragmatic warmth of a small community that has decided someone belongs in it. Word had reached the town ahead of them, because word always did, and people knew the broad strokes of what had happened, that the quiet seamstress from the boarding house had been carrying evidence against a criminal enterprise, and that the evidence had reached the right hands and that justice was coming in the federal variety, which was the most reliable kind. There was some exclamation and some curiosity, and a good deal of the particular respect that people accord to someone who has done a hard thing quietly, and without asking for help until the moment they needed to. Mr. Hawkins of the general store told Ella that her position was available whenever she wanted it, said with the bluntness of a man who does not do sentiment but wants his meaning clear. Mrs. Holt announced at supper the following evening that she would be needing Ella's room for an incoming boarder, and that Ella was therefore welcome to occupy the larger room on the second floor that had better light and a view of the street, which was understood by everyone at the table to be Mrs. Holt's way of ensuring that Ella could not easily leave again, which was correct, and was received by Ella with a smile she did not attempt to hide. The formal announcement of the engagement came on a Sunday, made with characteristic simplicity by Roy in Mrs. Holt's parlor after supper, where the relevant audience of Mrs. Holt Hawkins, the school teacher Miss Paulson, and 3 other regular boarders received it with the variety of responses available to small communities, which ranged from Mrs. Holt's triumphant and already expecting it warmth to Hawkins' brief firm nod to Miss Paulson's genuine delight. They were married in March of 1885 at the Dusty Creek Church, which was a modest building of pale stone with a wooden cross above the door and enough room for about 60 people, which was enough for everyone who wanted to come and several who were not specifically invited but came anyway. Ella wore a dress she made herself from ivory muslin with small blue flowers, cut with the skill of a woman who understood fabric and her own body and how to use one to honor the other. Roy wore his good suit, which was dark blue and fit him well, and his hair was combed, and he looked at her when she came through the church door with such open and complete happiness that she had to look down at the floor for a step to gather herself. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Hooks, who was 60 and had a pleasant manner and kept things appropriately brief, which both of them appreciated. Roy said his vows looking directly at her, which she had expected. She said hers looking directly at him, which she had not entirely known she would do until she was doing it, and the steadiness in his eyes when she did was the most secure she had ever felt in her life. After the reception, which was held in the street in front of the church because the weather was fine and Mrs. Holt had organized things with the efficiency of someone who has been planning this in her head since October, after the food and the handshakes and the genuine warmth of a small community celebrating something good, Roy and Ella walked back to the house that Roy had been renting for the past 3 years, which was a solid square building of 2 stories on the east edge of town, with a porch that caught the afternoon sun and a garden that had been mostly ignored for 3 years, and which Ella was already planning. They stood on the porch in the mild March evening with the town quiet around them and the sky going gold and rose in the west, and Roy put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they stood there for a while in the specific silence of people who have everything they need in the present moment. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I am. Are you?" "More than I know how to say," he said, "which is not a thing I expected to report tonight or any night." She looked up at him. "You are usually very good with words." "There is a category of feeling," he said, "for which the existing vocabulary is insufficient. I am in that category currently." She laughed and he kissed her hair and they went inside. The spring of that year was a good one. Ella's seamstress work had grown to the point where she was considering whether a small proper shop was a practical possibility, the question being one of cost and location, both of which she was capable of calculating precisely. She had a notebook where she kept figures, because old habits and genuine pleasure in the logic of accounts did not vanish because the circumstances changed, and she worked through the numbers in the evenings at the kitchen table while Roy sat across from her doing his own paperwork, the two of them quiet and occupied and comfortable in the shared industry that is one of the undervalued pleasures of a good marriage. Roy, in the absence of the immediate crisis that had taken him away in December, returned to the steady work of the law in the territory, which was less dramatic than it had been in earlier years as the region settled but was still meaningfully complex. He dealt with cattle disputes and land boundary arguments, and the occasional drunk and belligerent, and the sad slow work of mediating between established settlers and the newcomers who came in waves with the railroad's expansion, bringing different expectations and different habits that collided with the existing community in ways that required patience and judgment in equal measure. He was good at it. She watched him be good at it, which is one of the specific pleasures of knowing someone deeply, watching them in the thing they are suited for. She watched him talk a rancher named Bellows and a newcomer named Garrett through a fence-line dispute that had been escalating toward real hostility, watched him find the particular combination of firmness and respect that made both men feel heard without either feeling that they had capitulated. And she thought about the long, complex arc of this man's character, and how long it would take to know it fully, and felt, with great satisfaction, that she had a long time to find out. Summer came in hot and bright. The federal trial of Harlan Voss began in Abilene in June, and Ella received a letter from Birch's office informing her that her sworn statement and the ledger had been entered into evidence, and that her presence at the trial was not required, which was a relief of considerable magnitude. In August, another letter. Harlan Voss had been convicted on 8 counts of fraud, criminal intimidation, and conspiracy, and had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Judge Alden had been convicted separately on corruption charges and stripped of his position. Franklin Cutter, per his cooperation agreement, had received a sentence of 3 years. Ella read Birch's letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in August, and when Roy came in from his morning circuit she handed it to him without speaking. He read it and set it down and looked at her. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He came around the table and held her arms around her properly, her face against his neck, and she let herself be held and felt the finality of it, The way a thing can be over and still take a moment to settle into being over, the way the body needs time to believe what the mind has been told. She breathed against his shoulder and let the last of it go. "Thank you," she said. "For what specifically?" "For being in the livery doorway," she said. "Not letting me leave." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I heard you were leaving," he said, and his voice was exactly as it had been that morning in January, quiet in that particular way that contained everything he felt, and I knew that was not a thing I was capable of allowing. She stepped back and looked at him, and he looked at her, and it was the exact thing she had felt that morning, the recognition of something settled and permanent and chosen. "Good thing," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "A very good thing." In the autumn of 1885, Ella opened her shop. It occupied the front room of a small building on the main street of Dusty Creek, 2 doors down from Hawkins' General Store, with a window large enough to show the work she had pinned there for display, and a door that rang a small bell when it opened. She painted the sign herself in careful letters: Garner Crawford Seamstress and Alterations. She had debated the name for a week and arrived at the combination because it was true, and because both names were hers, and because she liked the way they sounded together, which was the same reason she had said yes on the road south of Santa Fe. The shop did well from the beginning. The territory had been settled long enough that people wanted clothing made properly and altered carefully, not just serviceable but right. She had a gift for it that was not just technical skill, but the ability to see what a person needed that they could not always articulate, and this gift transferred directly from the work of being kind to the work of being commercial. Women came from neighboring ranches. She made dresses and work clothes and children's garments, and repaired canvas and leather when asked, and found each different kind of work satisfying in its own way. She also kept the shop's accounts in a small red notebook, which bore no resemblance to the green ledger and no connection to any dark past, but which represented the same love of clear figures honestly kept that had been in her since she could add columns. The accounts were healthy by spring of 1886. She allowed herself to feel proud of this, which was something she had not always found easy. In the winter of 1886, she told Roy she was expecting a child. She told him on an evening in late November, sitting at the kitchen table over the supper dishes, because she had been thinking about how to say it for 2 weeks, and had arrived at the conclusion that there was no perfect formulation, and that simple directness, which they had always practiced together, was the right approach. He was very still for a moment after she told him. Then he looked at her with an expression that belonged to the category he had described on their wedding night, the one for which the existing vocabulary was insufficient. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Ella," he said, and her name in his voice contained everything. "I know," she said. "Are you?" "I am well. I feel well." "Good," he said. Then, with a small and wondering quality, "A child." "A child," she confirmed. He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed them there for a long moment and said nothing more, which said everything. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, for which Ella was grateful. The town's doctor, a thin young man named Hartwell who had arrived the previous spring from Philadelphia and was still adjusting to the particular demands of frontier medicine, attended her with competent conscientiousness. Mrs. Holt attended her with considerably less restraint, appearing at the shop with food and opinions on a near-daily basis, which was both somewhat overwhelming and genuinely touching. Roy was attentive in the particular way of a man who takes his responsibilities seriously and has the emotional intelligence to know that attentiveness does not mean hovering. He fixed things. He carried things. He asked how she was with an inquiry that was always specific rather than general, always interested in the true answer rather than the reassuring one. He read to her in the evenings when she was tired of her own thoughts, which he had always done occasionally as a pleasure, and now did more frequently as a gift. He read Dickens and also the newspapers, and also, once, a significant portion of a cattle husbandry manual in a tone of such deadpan seriousness that she laughed until she had to make him stop. Their son was born in July of 1887, on a hot Tuesday morning in the upstairs room of their house, attended by Dr. Hartwell and Mrs. Holt and Roy, who had not left the house since Ella's labor began at midnight, and who was present throughout in the steady and unflinching way of a man who understands that love is not selective about its circumstances. They named him James, which was Roy's father's name, chosen deliberately and thoughtfully, because Roy had said once that he had taken the hard things his father had given him and learned something from them, and that the name deserved to belong to someone who would do better with it. James Roy Crawford arrived in the world at 9 in the morning, weighing a considerable amount and expressing strong opinions about it in the traditional way of new persons. And when Hartwell put him in Ella's arms, she looked at him with the entirely disorienting experience of looking at something you did not know existed 2 minutes ago, and now cannot imagine being without. Roy sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at his son, and then at his wife with an expression she could not have described but knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "James," Roy said. "James," Ella agreed. The boy grew. He was dark like his father and had his mother's particular quality of attention, the habit of watching carefully before deciding. He was a cheerful and stubborn child with a considerable appetite and a gift for finding things to climb on. Roy taught him to ride when he was 4, which Ella photographed in her memory with the care of someone who knows they are watching something they will want to have kept, the small, serious boy on the patient old mare, Roy walking beside them with one hand near the bridle, and the patient, careful voice of a man who teaches the way he loves, thoroughly and without impatience. The town grew too. By 1888, Dusty Creek had a proper school, which Ella helped fund through a series of community events organized with Mrs. Holt, who proved to have organizational abilities that could have run a military campaign. The railroad spur that reached the town in that year brought new residents and new commerce, and the particular challenges of growth that Roy navigated with the same steady judgment she had watched him exercise for 3 years. He was offered the sheriff's position when Ed Marsh finally retired completely in 1889, which Roy accepted after a week of genuine deliberation, because he did not accept things that mattered without deliberating about them, and the deliberation always made whatever he decided more considered and more permanent. Sheriff Crawford, the sign read on the office door. Ella looked at it and felt a pride that was not for the title but for the man, for the fact that this particular man held this particular position in this particular community, for the rightness of that fit. In the spring of 1890, Ella discovered she was expecting again. She told Roy in the same direct way she had told him the first time across the kitchen table, and the expression on his face had the same quality as the first time but with an additional layer of something knowing in it, the difference between the overwhelming first experience and the full-hearted second. "Is James ready for this?" Roy said. "James will adapt," Ella said. "He is extremely adaptable. He has been climbing the barn rafters for 6 months." "I am aware," Roy said dryly. "I have had several conversations with him about the barn rafters. How are those going?" "About as well as conversations with a 3-year-old about structural hazards tend to go," she laughed. He smiled at her. Outside, they could hear James in the yard making the specific vocalization of a boy pretending to be a horse, which he had been doing for 3 consecutive days. Their daughter was born in December of 1890, another uncomplicated arrival, arriving in the world with the same strong opinions about it as her brother, but expressed at a higher pitch that Dr. Hartwell called impressive. They named her Clara, which was Ella's mother's name, and which Ella had known she would name a daughter since before she knew she would have one, since the days when her mother was alive and teaching her to read and telling her that her mind was a thing to be respected and used. Clara was born with her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular cheekbones, and from the first weeks showed the combination of her parents' stubbornness and her parents' capacity for warmth in a ratio that promised a great deal of personality. Roy held her with the ease of a man who had held his son for 3 years and knew how a small person fitted in his arms, and James viewed her with the ambivalent fascination of a child who has been told a considerable thing is coming and finds the reality both exactly as described and somehow still surprising. "She is very small," James told his father, with the seriousness of scientific observation. "You were also very small," Roy said. "You have improved considerably." James considered this. "She will improve too." "Yes," Roy said. "In my experience they generally do." James nodded, apparently satisfied. He offered Clara his finger, which she gripped with the ferocity of the newly arrived. James looked at his finger in her grip and then at his father with an expression of surprise and something warming in it. "She is strong," he said. "Yes," Roy agreed. "She is." Ella watched this exchange from across the room and felt the thing she had no words for, the thing larger than vocabulary. Her husband and her children in the warm kitchen of the house in Dusty Creek on a December evening in 1890, the lamplight on their faces, the sound of James's piping voice and Roy's quiet one, the smell of supper still in the air, and outside the first real snow of the winter beginning to come down soft and steady. She had left a city in Kansas with $12 and a stolen ledger, and a lie on her lips, and she had ridden into a small town with a blown horseshoe. And the entire trajectory of everything she now had hinged on a single thrown shoe, and the livery that happened to be in the town that happened to have a general store and a deputy sheriff with the particular quality of attention she had spent 3 months trying not to notice. The mathematics of it was staggering, if you thought about it from the perspective of probability. She thought about it sometimes, in the way you think about narrow passes, the exact dimensions of luck and decision that had brought you through. And she thought about the morning in the livery, the cold and the hay dust, and the voice that had gone quiet in a way she felt in the hollow of her chest, and how if he had not been standing in the doorway, if she had gotten Copper saddled 20 minutes earlier, if the morning had gone the way she intended it to go, all of this would not exist. She was very glad the morning had not gone as she intended. The years that followed had the particular quality of good years, the kind that accumulate gradually and are understood as good both in the living and in the memory, not because they were without difficulty, but because the difficulty was met together and the foundation underneath never shifted. Roy was sheriff of Dusty Creek for 11 years and was a good one. Ella's shop grew and employed 2 other women by the mid-1890s, and she taught them both the precision and the seeing that made the work more than just serviceable, and she found the teaching as satisfying as the making. James grew from the barn rafter climbing child into a serious and capable young person with his father's directness and his mother's precision, and Clara grew into exactly the force of personality that her first weeks had promised, with her mother's clear intelligence and her father's moral backbone, and her own particular gift for knowing what people needed, which she applied to everyone she encountered with the cheerful efficiency of someone who was born to it. Thomas Birch came to visit in 1893, making the trip from Santa Fe when his retirement from the marshal's office gave him time to travel for pleasure, and he sat at Ella and Roy's kitchen table and ate Mrs. Holt's pie and was introduced to James, who was 6, and Clara, who was 2, and he looked at Roy across the table with the expression of a man whose profound approval is rendered in silence. "You have done well," he said to Roy. "I have had considerable help," Roy said, with a look at Ella that she recognized as one of the ways he said the thing for which vocabulary was insufficient. "How is the evidence holding?" Ella asked. "In the Voss case." "Voss served 9 of the 12 years, Birch said. He was released 2 years ago. He has no money and no connections. The men who would have been his allies went down with him, or saw which way the wind was blowing and put distance between themselves and anything connected to his name. He is a finished man." Ella received this information and turned it over and found that what she felt was not triumph and not fear and not even relief exactly. It was more like the feeling of looking at a map you used to need desperately and now only want as a record of where you have been. "Good," she said. Good, Birch agreed. In the summer of 1895, with James 8 and Clara 4 and Dusty Creek settled into the comfortable prosperity of a well-established western town, Roy came home one evening from the sheriff's office with a look on his face that Ella recognized as the one he wore when he had been thinking about something with full concentration for an extended period. "Tell me what you are thinking," she said. He sat down at the kitchen table. "I have been thinking about the Prescott Ranch," he said. Old Prescott, the rancher who had come bleeding into Voss's office in Abilene, had finally come south into the territory with his family 3 years prior, buying a spread of land 20 miles east of Dusty Creek. He was a stooped and weathered man in his 70s now, with more land than he could properly work and a son who had gone east to school and shown no signs of returning. "He has been thinking about selling," Roy said. "He mentioned it last month." "I didn't say anything then, but I have been thinking about it." Ella looked at him. "You want to buy land?" "I want to buy that land," he said. "Not to work it ourselves necessarily, not immediately, but as he paused. James is 8. Clara is 4. This is not a permanent concern, but it is a future one." Ella considered this. She considered the accounts in the red notebook, the years of careful management, the state of their finances, which she knew in precise detail because she always knew it in precise detail. "We can afford it," she said, "if the price is reasonable." "I believe the price will be reasonable," Roy said. "Prescott is not a greedy man, and he likes the idea of it going to someone he knows." "Then you should talk to him," Ella said. He looked at her. "You are not opposed." "I am for anything that puts down roots," she said simply. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the way he had always done when the moment asked for it, the gesture that meant more than whatever words were available. The Prescott land was purchased in the autumn of 1895. It was a good piece of rangeland with a creek running through it, and a sound set of buildings that wanted some work, and a view of the mesas to the southwest that in certain lights was the most beautiful thing Ella had ever seen from a fixed point. They did not move to it immediately. Roy still had the sheriff's office, and the house in town was their home and their children's home, and the land was managed by a capable young rancher named Dunn who leased it and kept it well. But they went out to it on Sundays when the weather was good, riding out as a family with the children on their own horses by 1896, James on a steady roan, and Clara on a small gray mare she had named Lily with characteristic decisiveness. They would ride the perimeter of their land and eat their lunch on the creek bank, and Roy would tell the children things about the land that were both practical and more than practical. The way land holds water, the way the grass comes back after fire, the way a creek changes its path over decades, and how you can read the history of water in the shape of a valley. Ella would sit on the bank and watch her family in the winter light or the spring light or the long golden light of summer evenings, and she would feel the particular contentment that she had learned was the most reliable variety, not the acute happiness of exceptional moments, but the deep, steady warmth of a life that was good from the inside out. James asked her once, when he was 10, riding home beside her while Roy rode ahead with Clara on her gray mare, "Mama, how did you and Papa meet?" She considered her answer for a moment. How to tell a 10-year-old the truth of it in the right proportion? "I rode into Dusty Creek because my horse needed a rest," she said. "And I met your father at the general store." "Was it love at first sight?" he asked, with the skepticism of a person who has heard that phrase and is not sure he believes in it. "No," she said honestly. "It was more like recognizing something, slowly and then all at once." He considered this. "What did you recognize?" She looked at Roy's back ahead of them, the familiar set of his shoulders, the way he was leaning slightly toward Clara, telling her something that made the small girl laugh. "That he was the best kind of person," she said. "The kind that makes you want to be brave." James absorbed this with the thoroughness of a child who takes information seriously. "I think I understand that," he said. "Good," she said. "You will find that it applies in various situations throughout your life." They rode home through the winter afternoon, the 4 of them, through the rangeland that was partly theirs now and partly a town's, and partly the open country that belonged to no one and everyone. The sky above the mesas was going pink and orange in the west, and the cold was clean, and the horses moved in their steady, comfortable rhythm. And Ella rode in her family and her place and her chosen life, and thought about a morning in January of 1885, when she had stood in a livery with her hand on a saddle buckle, and a secret hidden against her ribs, and a man had stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands. "I heard you were leaving," he had said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way she felt in the hollow of her chest, and everything after that had been a consequence of that quietness and what it meant, of her turning around when she could have kept her back to him, of the choice that had turned out to be the best and truest and most important choice she had ever made, with her full and complete understanding of what she was choosing. Years on, the Green Ledger was held in the Federal Archives in Abilene as evidence, and would remain there. The small shop on Dusty Creek's Main Street had expanded twice and would expand again. The Prescott land, in years to come, would see James riding circuit on it with a capable manner that was his father's, and a precision with accounts that was his mother's. And Clara would grow into a woman of formidable character, who would do remarkable things. And Roy Crawford would one day sit on the porch of the house in town, watching his grandchildren in the yard, and feel the specific wonder of a man who arrived at something that was more than what he knew to hope for. But on the evening of 1895, with the pink sky above the mesas and the horses finding their rhythm homeward, it was enough and more than enough to be here, the four of them, in the life they had built together on the foundation of one man's quiet voice and one woman's decision to turn around. All the secrets had been told. All the running was done. All the fear had resolved into its final form, which was not the absence of danger, but the presence of something permanent enough that danger had ceased to be the organizing principle of existence. What was left, what had always been underneath the running and the hiding and the careful self-protection, was this: a man who had loved her honestly, a life made together from choices both of them had understood the weight of, and the particular kind of happiness that is not luck but labor, and not luck but choice, and not luck, though some luck was in it, the lucky shoe and the lucky town and the lucky morning. Ella Crawford, who had been Ella Garner, who had ridden into Dusty Creek with $12 and a lie and a secret, reached home in the last light of that autumn evening, and swung down from Copper's successor. A good bay mare she had also named Copper in honor of the original, and Roy was there beside her, handing down Clara, and James was already at the barn with the enthusiasm of a child who loves horses more than almost anything. And Roy looked at her over the horses' backs with the gaze she had known for 10 years and still felt with the same precise clarity as the first time. "Good day," he said. "Very good day," she said. He came around the horses and kissed her in the yard in the evening light, brief and easy, and entirely unself-conscious. The kiss of two people who have been kissing each other for a decade and have not lost the pleasure of it. And Clara made the sound of a 4-year-old who finds parental affection acceptable and slightly boring, which was exactly right. The barn doors were wide open, and the lamp was lit inside, and James was talking to his horse, and the sky was still pink above the mesas, and the air smelled of cold grass and horses, and supper beginning on the kitchen stove. And Ella stood in her yard, in her town, in her territory, in her life, and was, simply and completely and without reservation, home.